Do you remember what you said to me, brother? Do you remember what you said to me as we fought before the Pyramid of Photep? Do you remember the words you used? I do. And as I recall, your face was tortured. Imagine that. The Master of Wolves, his ferocity twisted into grief. And yet you still carried out your duty. You always did what was asked of you. So loyal, so tenacious. Truly, you were the attack dog of the Emperor. Now you took no pleasure in what you did. I knew that then, and I know it now. But all things change, my brother. I'm not the same as I was. And you're, well, let us not mention where you are now.
Hello everyone, my name is Killer Saw, and I am here to talk to you and teach you all about Warhammer lore. So, we're going to start off in our Demon Primarch series, we're continuing our Demon Primarch series, and we're going to be talking about Magnus the Red. Now, Magnus the Red, or known as the Red Cyclops or various other names, is kind of a discussion of like, okay, so Magnus is kind of a very interesting character because of how sympathetic he is. He's so sympathetic, it's to the point where there's a meme that goes around in the community that Magnus did nothing wrong. This is untrue, by the way. Magnus definitely did do wrong. The thing is that Magnus is actually incredibly sympathetic. He's by far the most sympathetic out of all of the Primarchs. And it's what makes him such a good character that people vibe with a lot of his intentions. Now, does that mean he did do wrong? Abso-fucking-lutely. He definitely did do wrong. And I think people need to acknowledge that more, because people forget how skewed morality can be in the Warhammer universe. Remember, no one is a good guy in the Warhammer universe. It's just different people have more sympathetic upbringings than the others. But really, what matters the most about Magnus is like his motivations. His motivations for the reasons why he does the things he does is honestly what makes him such a compelling character. And this is why whenever I was just looking into him, I kind of felt a little sorry for the guy. And yeah, so moving forward, let's start out a bit briefly about Magnus's lore. We're not going to really go into his childhood very much, because his childhood you don't really need to know a whole lot about. All you really need to know about Magnus's childhood is that Magnus is kind of this character that's like, how should I put it? He's a psyker. So what a psyker is it's essentially a wizard that uses the power of the Immaterium to conjure magic, warp reality to fit their whim. Most of the time it's usually depicted as them like casting lightning, but like the abilities that psychers can use vary wildly, and even more so in people that actually are adept at using the warp, which Magnus actually is, considering he's probably the most powerful psyker out of all of the Primarchs. And he's naturally gifted. He's so powerful with psychic energy, it's to the point where his body is more of a vessel for that psychic energy. Now, when we're talking about Magnus's childhood, he grew up on the planet of Photep. Now, Photep was a world of sorcerers that he ruled as their messiah. But that's not the unique part about Magnus's childhood. You know, most of the Primarchs were seen as messiah-like figures amongst their people. Some have more interesting backstory than others. But Magnus's backstory, frankly, isn't all that interesting. What is interesting is the things he knew during his backstory. Knowingly, much like Conrad Kurz, he actually knew who the Emperor was before he even met him, and had actually been in communication with him psychically for several years. And that's what kind of makes his relationship with the Emperor so unique, is that he kind of had the Emperor around a little bit for his childhood. It's just he only was able to meet him in his adulthood in a physical capacity. It's basically, imagine it like you meet your dad online for the first time, and you then meet in real life and then realize, oh wow, cool, you're kind of a shitbag. But that's besides the point. The point is that during this time, whenever Magnus was with the Emperor, Magnus went on expeditions with his father, and would study the Immaterium and would be warned about the entities that lurked within. Entities that will trick and mess with your mind in order to get what they want. And this will come into factor later, as many of these warp entities were described and have been documented, but warp entities are kind of a mystery in and of themselves that we might actually discuss in a future video that I'm actually thinking of making. But here's where it gets interesting, is that Magnus was given the 15th Space Marine Legion, otherwise known as the Thousand Sons. Now, the reason why they're called the Thousand Sons is because they have a problem. So the problem with the 15th Legion is that they have mutations in their bodies that make them unfit to be Space Marines. In fact, the reason why they are called the Thousand Sons is because Magnus's gene seed is unstable, and so it caused them to undergo horrible mutations, and the only Space Marines that were fit to even serve Magnus were only in the 1,000, which is why they're called the Thousand Sons, as you can see, because it's the only 1,000 Space Marines that can actually serve under Magnus. But they're still not even viable for combat in any regard of the word. They're disheveled, they're not very strong, they're not capable of fighting strength. But Magnus wanted to fix this, and he wanted to use his knowledge of the warp in order to fix this. So he tapped into the warp, sacrificing his left eye in order to save his Space Marine Legion. And miraculously, it actually worked. Sacrificing his eye actually worked and made it to where his Legion was actually able to participate in the Great Crusade as a psychic legion. You see, whenever this happened, Magnus's Legion started to gain supernatural abilities similar to his, casting sorceries, manipulating people's minds, and doing all sorts of crazy shit. And this is where the Thousand Sons, whenever they would conquer planets, they would actually brainwash entire populations into worshiping the Emperor. They would brainwash people. They would, like, most of the time when Magnus conquered planets, he didn't even need to fire a single shot, because he was able to brainwash the entirety of the people and convince them to worship the Emperor unashamedly. But as the Great Crusade waned on, and as he used the Psychic Legion more often, many of the Primarchs that were his brothers actually started to dislike this practice. Most notoriously, Leman Russ and Mortarion, which we talked about the reason why Mortarion doesn't like Psychers in that video, so go watch that video after this one to get full context on that. But what you really need to know with this is that Leman Russ didn't exactly like how Magnus would engage in warfare, and he would periodically criticize Magnus for his practices, on how he does war and conflict. And that's what makes his relationship with Leman Russ kind of dicey a bit. Same thing with Mortarion, but Mortarion it's more so from firsthand experience with Psychers. Again, go watch the Mortarion video if you want more info on that. But basically, they would be conquering planets, and everything was going good. And even though the Emperor was okay with it, he was still very hesitant about it. Until something happened. So what happened to make Magnus what happened here? So the flesh virus actually would come back, but it would come back worse than it ever had, and would turn his legion into entities known as Chaos Spawn. Now, if you've played games like Vermintide or Darktide, or even the Rogue Trader game, you know what essentially what a Chaos Spawn is. And and for those of you who don't know, a Chaos Spawn is essentially an amalgamation of flesh and warp energy that is this giant, massive flesh monster that destroys everything in its path. And eventually, multiple members of the Legion were turning into these massive flesh monsters and were wreaking havoc within their own ranks. This illness got so bad that Magnus would start to collect knowledge from a lot of the civilizations he would conquer and hoard knowledge of the warp and how to utilize it best, and would compile it into a compendium known as the Book of Magnus. Eventually, the flesh virus got so bad that Magnus had to take his legion all the way back to Photep, to the capital city of Zika. Now, on Zika, he was able to treat them for medically and psychically, but here's where the story gets really fucking tragic. You see, Magnus, during his time with his legion, treated them as if they were family, and he took them being called the Thousand Sons literally. He literally treated the Thousand Sons as his kids and actively cared for them. He would be seen in the halls of the medical wing reading them fucking stories, like actually spending time with them and being like almost like an actual father to them, and being this mentor and guardian, teaching other sorcerers how to use sorcery more effectively. He was a very gentle person, and was not about hoarding knowledge from people. But eventually, the Emperor caught wind of what Magnus was doing, and this would result in the Emperor calling for a council of all the Primarchs and Malkador the Sigillite in something called the Council of Nika. Now, at the Council of Nika, we did talk about it briefly in the Mortarion video, so we'll go deeper into it now. So the way the Council of Nika worked is that they were going to discuss whether or not psychic warfare should be banned within the Imperium. Now, we don't really need to know about all the debates that went in the Council of Nika, but all you really need to know is that the Emperor himself deemed it unnecessary and frankly unsafe. This came to the pleasure of Leman Russ and Mortarion, but Magnus begrudgingly accepted this, and even though he knew that sorcery was the only way his legion would survive, unfortunately. Now, Magnus would then go back to the planet of Photep, and he would go there to rest and be prepared for the next crusade to be sent on. And during his slumber of the coming days, he would get visions of a dark future, of what the Imperium would eventually become, and the civil war that would lead to the Imperium's fall. Particularly the Horus Heresy. He would witness Horus's fall, he would witness the death of Sanguinius, and he would witness the Emperor being placed upon the Golden Throne. And this would terrify him so much that he would try his best to get in touch with the Emperor. He didn't want this future to come to pass. And eventually, the Emperor kind of realize, like, okay, so what happened is that Magnus tried to first get in contact with Horus, but unfortunately, he was too late. Horus had already turned to the forces of chaos, and now Magnus had no choice but to psychically try to contact the Emperor. So he channeled he astral projected himself within the warp to try to travel to Terra. But notice a massive webway tunnel blocking Terra. And so he used all of his psychic might to tear open this hole and try to get into the throne room to talk to the Emperor where he was. Unknowingly, Magnus unleashed a legion of demons on the people of Terra, as what that webway portal was a massive webway project that the Emperor was working on. And this fucking pissed the Emperor off to such a degree that he declared Magnus a traitor, especially after he basically told the Emperor that, well, Horus is evil. He's like, no, my son could never do that. My son could never do that. Yeah, my son Horus could never lead a massive, like, fucking coup against me. Cue the fucking video.
I never wanted this. I never wanted to unleash my legions. Together we banished the ignorance of old night. But you betrayed me. You betrayed us all. You stole power from the gods and lied to your sons. Mankind has only one chance to prosper. If you will not seize it, then I will!
Yeah, so anyway, Magnus would realize that he was declared a traitor by the Emperor, and the Emperor would send Leman Russ to try to take down Magnus the Red and lead an invasion force and burn Prospero to the ground. And eventually, Leman Russ would also get into contact with Horus, who had been turned at the time, and Horus would tell Leman Russ, hey, you go, this is the word of the Emperor, go kill Magnus. He's like, but I was only told to capture him. I'm like, I am literally second in command of the Imperium. My word is the Emperor's. And then Leman Russ was like, okay, cool, bet. And then proceeded to burn Prospero to the ground. It was to the point where entire cities were laid to waste. But before the planet was invaded, Magnus would send his legion out across the system before the planet was invaded and put up a psychic shield, basically preventing his people from seeing the oncoming invading force and essentially using them as a psychic sacrifice. Eventually, Leman Russ would catch up with Magnus and challenge him to a duel. In this duel, Magnus would get the upper hand on Leman and I believe he cut his arm or something. But then, as Leman lurched back, he grabbed Magnus and lifted him above his head and then cracked him on his fucking knee. And as Magnus laid there, paralyzed and dying, he would call out to Tzeentch. He knew of the Chaos God that was tricking him. And he would call out to Tzeentch and tell him, please, give me the power to save my people. And he begrudgingly asked Tzeentch for help. And almost immediately, Tzeentch gave him exactly what he wanted, turning him into a demon Primarch and sending him to the planet of sorceries within the warp and the city of Zika. But in the process, Prospero was gone and left to its own devices. The planet was destroyed, Magnus's homeworld was gone. And Magnus would then have the remnants of the city of Zika as a reminder of what happened on that day on the planet of sorcery. Now, he would later on participate in the Horus Heresy and help in the Siege of Terra alongside Mortarion. But here's the problem that also arose. The flesh virus came back again, and probably the worst it had ever been. And oh boy. So a council of sorceries underneath Magnus devised a plan to try to cure their brothers once and for all. And the way they did it fucked them up forever. Now, Sorcerer Ahriman would eventually cast a spell that was supposed to cure them of their ailment. But in reality, it turned their souls into dust. Dust that will forever inhabit their armor, as they have no feelings, no emotions. They're just emotionless automatons that are really no longer human anymore. Magnus was, of course, pissed by this and would defeat Ahriman in a magical duel, but then Tzeentch would intervene and whisk Ahriman away. And now, to this day, Magnus waits at the top of the tower in the remnants of the city of Zika, plotting his revenge on the false emperor and the false imperium. So yeah, Magnus did do a lot wrong, but his motivations are very sympathetic. He wanted to save his sons. He wanted to save them. And he was willing to do anything, mutilating his own body, making deals with warp entities in order to save the people he cared about. But the thing is that this would end up costing them pretty much everything, as Tzeentch isn't someone you want to make deals with lightly. And granted, Magnus didn't know he was making deals with Tzeentch and was unknowingly doing it, but he was still going against the wishes of his father and engaging with warp entities. Now, this is why I think Magnus is very much in the wrong, especially when he accidentally unleashed a legion of demons on fucking Terra. And all just so he could accuse Horus. And granted, he was right, but still, this was a massive plot done by Tzeentch. Like basically, while Magnus was playing checkers, Tzeentch was playing chess with his as if he was a fucking pawn. And Magnus could not get out of this deal because he didn't know who he was dealing with. And he didn't know Tzeentch was pulling his puppet master strings behind the scenes. Now, and this also does explain how in Space Marine 2, when you do fight the Thousand Suns, when you pull off their fucking helmet, they're all dust. They're not actually people anymore. They're huskless souls that forever inhabit their armor. And it's honestly a fate arguably worse than death. Being a fucking unfeeling automaton working through the power of nothing but magic. I mean, for God's sake, they can't even speak anymore. They're mindless. And so the family that Magnus once had is basically gone. So yeah, Magnus, while he is very sympathetic, is by far not as morally good as a lot of people think. He's more morally gray, and he was willing to do hard things in order to save his sons. But as the old saying goes, the way to hell is paved in good intentions. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I am so sorry that this video is late. I wanted to post this on Wednesday the 18th, but unfortunately my internet was fucking up and my video was audio was super fucked. I had to completely start this from scratch, aside from the intro that you had just seen in the beginning. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I do plan on doing more horror-based content. I might discuss warp entities in October, and also maybe might go in a little bit to Vashtor the Archifane, which who's one of my new favorite Chaos characters. He's super cool. So I hope you guys stay tuned for that. And as always, make sure you stay healthy and stay happy. And I'm out of here.